Merrill's first principles of instruction is a fairly basic instructional design model, but one which can be quite useful, in particular because it's quite broad and because it is quite kind of simple and straightforward. The first principles of instruction, they're typically used for any kind of learning which would be problem-based, or any learning environment which would be problem-based. So any piece of TEL or any course of instruction which would be really focused on solving a particular problem or dealing with a problem, Merrill lends itself quite well to that. And the idea behind Merrill's first principles of instruction is that they basically involve the students in 4 phases. Activation, so activation of prior experience or knowledge. Demonstration, which would be demonstration of skills, demonstration of a particular performance or how to do something. Application, which would be application of what the learner has learnt. And integration, which means integrating these skills into real-world environments. So even based on that, you can see how that approach would lend itself effectively to kind of problem and problem-based learning. Now, one of Merrill's big beefs, he says, is that very often a lot of instructional practice concentrates on the first 2 phases, or even nearly primarily just the second phase, and ignores the other phases in the cycle of learning. So if you did want to use Merrill's principles of instructions as a instructional design approach, or even as, an evaluation of a piece of learning, what is important is that you're able to look at, well, does it get the learner to apply and to integrate what they have learned into their kind of day-to-day life or into their kind of practice. Merrill identifies that learning is best facilitated when learners are engaged in solving real-world problems, when existing knowledge is activated as a foundation for the new knowledge, when new knowledge is demonstrated to the learner, when new knowledge is applied by the learner, and when new knowledge is integrated into the learner's world. So I suppose what we are looking at for our purposes is a little bit of a bastardization of what was originally there. A lot of this kind of is based on Merrill's instructional transaction theory, which is kind of like a second generation instructional design. So it kind of took a lot of what Gagne did and it looked to kind of build on that, and kind of focused on this notion that different learning outcomes require different conditions of learning. And his initial idea around the instructional transaction theory was kind of based around these things called knowledge frames. So knowledge frames basically refers to ways in which course information is organized. So we talked a little bit before when we were talking about cognitivism about schemas, which are kind of ways in which our brains or our kind of working memory are able to organize information. So you can think of knowledge frames as a little bit like that. And I suppose his whole idea with the instructional transaction theory was about building up appropriate instructional transactions into instructional development tools. And he took almost like kind of a semi-software based approach on this. So you could think of it almost like early computer-based instructional design. And his whole notion that this would, if you think about this as a process, that this approach would automate certain steps of the instructional design process and would increase efficiency. But I suppose that's fairly secondary to I suppose our purposes, which is very much based on the basics representation of the first principles of instruction, which we looked at a little bit earlier. So you can see there, even in terms of how the kind of visually that's represented, there's a problem which is at the center of everything, and the learner then goes through those 4 phases in kind of a cyclical motion. So he's starting off with activation, to demonstration, to application, to integration. So at the center is this notion that it's problem based, and learners should be focused on solving real world problems. Now, his whole notion was that, I suppose, his use of the word problem includes a wide range of activities, so it's maybe not as limited as we would kind of think about it nowadays. For some people, problem is engaging in some form of simulation or device or situation. For others, it just means being involved in some form of real world task. So I wouldn't get too bogged down on the notion of what is a problem. It's fairly broadly applicable, and if you kind of take problem-based learning as a fairly general term, it kind of works for that. So the notion is that kind of learners are engaged in solving real-world problems, and the way in which that is done is that learners are shown the task that they will be able to do, or the problem that they're going to be asked to solve. There's a notion that learning is promoted when learners are engaged in all levels of a problem. So that means they're not just engaged at the operational level or the action level. They're involved in kind of everything. And Merrill kind of broke that down into, again, 4 rough kind of levels. So there's the problem, there's the task required to solve the problem, there's the operations that comprise the task, and there's the actions that comprise the operations. You don't need to stick to that absolutely clearly, but the important point is that learners, if you're looking at Merrill's transactional theories, they're involved at all and engaged in all levels of the problem. So it's not just one bit of it, it's all of the problem. And the other point he made around the problem and the notion of a problem is that learning is promoted when the problem is part of a progression of problems. So to master a complex problem, you first start with a less complex problem, and when that is done, you move on to a more complex problem, and through a progression of more and more complex problems, students improve until they're able to solve very complex problems. And this maybe speaks a little bit to the kind of representation of it as a cycle. So maybe a small bit like Sam, it's not that you kind of do this once and then that's it, done and dusted. If you're doing it properly, then Merrill would say that that you're basically when you finish one iteration, you're going to repeat it until you get kind of a bigger and bigger picture. But that'll hopefully become clear a little bit later on. So the first step of it is activation, and the notion here is that existing knowledge is activated as a foundation for new knowledge. And the notion that learning is kind of promoted, or it's kind of engaged in learners when they're able to recall or relate or describe or apply knowledge that they have from a previous experience or from previous learning. And he suggested that one good way of doing that was to provide relevant experience that can be used as a foundation for new knowledge. So ways in which you might do that, for example, is to try and appeal to what learners already know. So to try and, present that in a particular way. Now that could be done through any number of ways. You could give learners a situation which they might be familiar with. You might give them something analogous to, kind of day-to-day activities. You might ask them a question which is almost like a thought experiment, or to try and appeal to their existing experience. For example, have you ever thought about this? Or, when you're going to the shops and you kind of go to the checkout, did you ever notice that XYZ? So the notion with this is really that kind of, it can be, I suppose at a basic level, it can be very overwhelming when you're faced with a huge amount of new information which you can't really relate to. So the notion of kind of identifying, referring to existing experience, or getting learners some bit kind of getting the problem to kind of align to learners' existing kind of frames of reference is a very kind of useful tool. And you see this quite a lot in elementary school as well. It's a very important element in terms of, I suppose, how primary schools and elementary schools would try and engage kind of kids coming in for the first time. You try and build on existing experience, existing knowledge that they have, so it's not too daunting for them or difficult for them. And yeah, it's going to mention their recalled structures that can organize new knowledge. So, if learners have a mental model that can be used to organize new knowledge, they should be encouraged to use this. And again, that goes back a little bit to the kind of schemas that we talked about when we were looking at cognitivism. Now, that structure, what is important to note is that, learners will be different. Not every group of learners is going to have experience or knowledge of, related structures. So, for example, if I'm talking about, something in maths, I'm terrible at maths, so it's very hard for me to be able to relate existing mathematical knowledge to something which is being presented to me. So, things like metaphor, like analogies, trying to kind of, frame it in a way that's kind of fairly common and fairly understandable to lay people, or, whoever your learners are, is an important step in being able to activate new knowledge. And we saw it a little bit when we were talking about, I think, cognitivism again, and, the use of instructional cues. At the beginning of a course of learning, starting off with like talking about, asking learners to begin by engaging with the question, have you ever thought about this? Did you ever notice this? In your job role, does this situation ever arise? So beyond activation is demonstration, and demonstration is when new knowledge is demonstrated to the learners. And I suppose this is something which we would at this stage, I think, be pretty familiar with. It's kind of, at the core of a lot of what we covered is how you present information to learners. So the notion is that kind of you try and demonstrate, or Merrill would recommend that you try and demonstrate new knowledge in a way that is consistent with the learning goals. So, you would use things like examples, you would use things like demonstrations, visualizations, so on and so forth. I suppose the point here is really that kind of, depending on the type of information that you're trying to provide to the learner, you should be trying to present it in an appropriate way. Now, we'll be looking at that a small bit deeper before the end of the semester, but, I suppose for e-learning purposes, you could look at it like, if I'm going to try and teach someone how to use a piece of software, then screencasting is probably a good way of doing that. If I'm going to do a live performance or demonstration of something, video is a good way to represent that. If I'm trying to explain a concept, an animation might be a useful way to do that. So, I suppose for Merrill's purposes, it's quite a generic point. For our purposes, it takes on, a fairly specific meaning in terms of digital education. But if you were going to use Merrill as kind of an as an evaluation criteria for assignment 2, then, that is an important point. Is this course representing the relevant information in the right way? If everything is kind of text and you're talking about, using that to try and represent performance and concepts and so on and so forth to a learner, then it's probably failing down. And that maybe goes to the third point there, to use media in an effective way and to not let multiple forms compete. So again, we think about Mayer's principles, a lot of what he mentioned around kind of, avoiding gratuitous use of media or stuff that doesn't really contribute to the learner's learning. I'd maybe disagree with him in terms of letting multiple forms compete, but you can maybe read that as like, do not overburden the user with different forms of media. So Mayer's principles, I think, kind of covers that quite well, really. The other thing then is in terms of providing appropriate learner guidance. So, directing learners to the relevant information, focusing on the important information, presenting multiple representations as might be required, providing onboarding, providing access to additional resources such as glossaries, such as additional links for kind of learners to kind of deepen their knowledge. Demonstration is, as I said, kind of something that I think you would have a good understanding of to date. So following on from demonstration comes application. An application is where new knowledge is applied by the learner. So essentially, and going back to kind of what's at the center of Merrill's diagram, application would involve learners using their knowledge in a problem-solving task. So it's not just enough that they recall it or present it or kind of, take an MCQ about what they have learned. This would very much apply towards problem solving, and that they would use this new knowledge to solve a problem or solve a task. Merrill suggests a number of different kind of types of practice. So practice might be information about, which is where learners would be kind of, in a real world context, kind of having to pull up information about what they've learned, or being able to kind of present information about what they've learned. Parts of practice, which might be learners identifying different elements of a particular problem or problem solving approach. Kinds of practice, which would require learners to identify, for example, new examples or examples of the problem or the solution to the problem. How-to practice, which is where learners would actually do the procedure. And what happens, which is where learners would, for example, predict the consequence of a particular process or a condition or situation, or be able to improve on it or make recommendations around it. And an important point for Merrill, and obviously this is very true, that all of this should be accompanied by feedback and guidance. And, something which we talked about a bit when we looked at Rosenheck and kind of learning experience design, he also suggested that feedback and guidance would be kind of withdrawn as learners' capacities increase and as their performance improves. So this notion that you provide feedback and guidance, but you provide that kind of scaffolding, but that is kind of gradually withdrawn as time goes on and as learners get better. Integration then is where the new knowledge is integrated into the learner's world, into their everyday life or their kind of work life. And a couple of points Merrill had for integration is that you should provide learners an opportunity to publicly demonstrate their new skills or knowledge. And I suppose this is quite a human kind of habit. When we learn something new, very often our first desire is to show it to a friend or family or whatever. And if you think about computer games, one thing which games are very kind of good at doing is kind of consistently encouraging the learner to kind of show off their skill, to represent their kind of progress. That's why there's this notion of levels and kind of, that characters, I go from a level 1, whatever, to a level 10, whatever, things like that. So this notion that for integration, it is important that they demonstrate their acquired skills, and to a degree that they do that publicly. That doesn't have to mean to the world at large. It might just mean to a select group, so for example, the class. For integration, it's important that you allow learners to reflect on, discuss and defend their new knowledge and information. And reflection in particular is certainly something which is I think gaining more and more traction the entire time as a means of integrating knowledge into their own, into learners' own environments. So for example, a lot of the out of class activities which I would ask you to do, you'll notice that, as I've said, the point isn't to produce the app or to produce the LX canvas filled in. The key thing is to reflect on it, for you to, have a think about your experience with it, what you liked, what you didn't like, what would work for you, what didn't work for you. So reflection is a very, very useful tool for helping people integrate new skills, new knowledge into their kind of daily life. And finally, that for integration, you let learners own their new skills. So when learners can create or invent or explore or adapt the knowledge and skill that they've learnt, that they can modify it for their own purposes, that really is a very good representation that integration has been accomplished. That they're kind of, because it means the learner is kind of moving beyond the instructional environment, and they're taking, the classroom, the online course, whatever, and they're taking it into the kind of wider world and revising it and editing it and changing it for their own purposes. So you can really see that as kind of as a real result in terms of the learning process. Now, like I mentioned, it's kind of, Merrill suggests as well that kind of feedback and that guidance would be kind of gradually withdrawn as time goes on. But the other thing is that kind of he recommends that, if you think about, like we said, if you think about a problem not just by itself, but one small problem is part of a larger problem, is part of a larger problem, is part of a larger problem. What he recommends is that you focus initially on a small problem or a particular part of a larger problem, and as time goes on, as learners improve, as they become more effective, and as they become more as they develop their skills and knowledge, that they go from simple to complex. Again, is something we've seen again and again. They go from a small problem or a small part of a larger problem to a bigger part, to a bigger part, to a bigger part, to the full problem. And as they're doing that, guidance and kind of feedback is withdrawn. And again, this is something we've seen with Rosenheck and all, this notion that you start off with a lot of scaffolding, with a lot of structure, but you gradually withdraw that as learners become more competent until they're working entirely independently. So in terms of assignment 2, I suppose one of the advantages of Merrills principles is that it's very broad, and it provides a real structure if you're looking at any piece of TEL or any learning experience. So if a piece of TEL is problem-based, you can look at it with a view to, okay, well, what is the problem? And based on that, is this piece of TEL activating learners' prior experiences? Are there instructional cues at the beginning? Does it demonstrate it in an effective way? Is it using media correctly? We look at Mayer's principles. Is it kind of following all of those? Is the selection of media correct for what it's trying to achieve? How well or how poorly does it manage in terms of helping learners apply and integrate the new knowledge and skills? Is it getting them to perform activities? Is it providing them with feedback and guidance? Is it encouraging them to make it their own? Is it supporting that process? As Merrill identified, very often a lot of learning focuses on step 1 and step 2, but it doesn't do a great job very often when it comes to step 3 and step 4. So, the kind of activities it gets a learner to do, the kind of additional guidance it provides it in terms of integrating it into one's own experience, into one's own practice. Those are important elements. So Merrill's first principle of instruction, it's very applicable, and I would say it's also in a way quite harsh, because it's not always possible to apply for a piece of TEL to kind of support application and integration. It might be beyond the remit of the piece of TEL, but that then does give you, if you're looking to assignment 2, it gives you a good bit to talk about in terms of, well, here's how it would improve, here's how it could be made better. It could add in additional steps for application, it could add in additional steps for integration.